I've never been good at explaining why I went back to that house. Even now, 2 years after the trial, people look at me with a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. They want to know if I saw the signs. They want to know if I hate her. The truth is, I don't know what I feel. I just know that the silence in that house, the silence that settled in after the funeral, never really left. My Uncle Julian was the kind of man who filled a room just by existing. He was 72, a titan of industry who had built a quiet empire in shipping. By the time I was 26, my role in the family was mostly that of a buffer. When the Alzheimer's started, it wasn't a slow fade. It was like a blackout. One day he was debating fiscal policy. The next he was trying to feed his watch to the dog. My Aunt Elena, his wife of 40 years, took it with a stoic, almost terrifying grace. She was 60, elegant, and had always been the sort of woman who kept her back straight even when the sky was falling. I spent that summer at their estate in the Berkshires. It was an isolationist dream. Sprawling grounds, thick woods, and an old stone structure that felt more like a tomb than a home. The staff had been let go as his condition worsened, leaving just us. It started with the pacing. Julian would walk the perimeter of the living room for hours, his footsteps rhythmic, hollow, clicking against the hardwood. Elena would sit in the wingback chair, embroidery in her lap, watching him. She didn't look sad. She looked like she was waiting for a train that was already late. "He's trapped, Arthur," she said to me one evening. Her voice was thin, sharp as glass. "A mind like his. He knows. He told me he wouldn't let the white walls take him. He made me promise. I didn't ask what the promise was. I think, deep down, I knew." The tension in the house began to manifest in the walls themselves. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of scraping. Not a frantic scratching, but slow, deliberate dragging. I'd go into the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my feet, and find Julian standing at the window, staring into the black expanse of the trees. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. When I'd call his name, he wouldn't turn. He'd just whisper, "She's checking the latch, Arthur. She's checking the latch." I told myself it was just the disease. But I couldn't ignore the way Elena started leaving the heavy brass key to the gun cabinet on the mahogany desk in the library. She stopped hiding her fatigue and started wearing it like a uniform. The air felt heavy, like it does before a massive thunderstorm, the kind where the pressure makes your ears pop. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. The house was stiflingly quiet. I was in the kitchen when I heard the sharp, unmistakable crack of dry, violent sound that echoed through the marble entryway like a gunshot in a kitchen. I froze, the kettle in my hand trembling. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. No scream, no struggle, just that single, punctuating sound. I walked toward the study. I didn't want to see what was behind the door, but my feet moved anyway. Elena was standing by the desk, her back to me. The room smelled of ozone and copper. She was holding the small, ornate revolver, her hand perfectly steady, pointed downward. Julian was sitting in his chair, slumped forward, his head tucked into his chest as if he'd simply fallen asleep during a particularly boring meeting. The hole in the back of his head looked small, almost inconsequential, against the dark leather of the chair. She didn't jump. She didn't cry. She just turned, looked at me, and sighed. "It's time, Arthur. Go call the police." The trial was a blur of flashing bulbs and whispering reporters. The lawyer, a man who had known them for decades, finally cracked under the pressure of the DA's questions. He pulled a letter from his briefcase that packed. It was dated a year prior, signed in Julian's firm, elegant hand. It laid out the terms of their mercy. It was supposed to be a secret, a private exit strategy, but it became a public spectacle. She served 24 months. The parole board cited her age, the circumstances, and the letter as sufficient grounds for release. But the real horror wasn't the trial or the news cycle. It was the aftermath. Last month, I visited her at the small cottage she moved into after the estate was sold. We sat in the kitchen, the sunlight hitting the floor in long, dusty rectangles. She was drinking tea, her movements as elegant as they had ever been. "You know Arthur," she said, not looking at me, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the stove used to be. I still hear him walking. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Elena, he's gone." She finally looked at me, and there was a terrifying vacancy in her gaze, the same look Julian used to have. "I know, but some deals don't end when the breathing stops." He keeps walking the perimeter of my bedroom every night, measuring the room. I left shortly after that. I haven't gone back. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my own apartment, the silence gets too thick, and I could swear I hear a faint, rhythmic dragging against the floorboards of the empty space behind my head. Just a soft, deliberate scraping. And I find myself lying perfectly still, afraid to turn around and see if he's still keeping his side of the bargain. I don't talk about my early childhood much. Most people my age, I'm 28 now, living in a quiet apartment complex in suburban Ohio, have hazy, warm memories of toys and birthday cakes. My memories are sensory, but they aren't warm. They are cold, flickering, and heavy with a kind of silence that feels like a weight on your chest. When I was 2, I lived in a cramped, carpet-stained trailer in a town outside of Dayton with my biological mother. She was a woman who lived in the margins, someone who looked through you even when she was staring right at you. I don't remember her face clearly, but I remember the smell of burnt plastic and stale cigarettes that clung to her clothes, and the way she'd press a cool, damp cloth against my forehead when I got fussy. That's what she called it, fussy. Looking back, with the information I later got from my adoptive parents, I understand what that meant. She was feeding me heroin and Valium to keep me sedated, to keep me from crying while she stared at the wall or drifted off on the peeling linoleum of the kitchen floor. It was a chemical silence. When the money ran out, or when the sickness set in for her, she would bundle me into a rusted sedan and drop me off at my grandmother's house. My grandmother was a stern woman who blamed my existence for my mother's spiral. She'd take me in, but she didn't know how to care for a toddler who was going through systemic withdrawals. She just thought I was a difficult, sickly child. I remember the screaming my own, raw and desperate, and the way the light in the hallway would seem to warp and stretch as I lay in a crib that felt like a cage. My body would shake. My skin would feel like it was vibrating against the sheets, and I would wait for the door to open, expecting her to come back with that familiar, numbing relief. She never did. Not when I needed her to. I was eventually taken away. The transition to my adoptive home was like waking up from a long, feverish dream. My parents were patient, kind, and steady. They gave me structure, nourishment, and, most importantly, clarity. By the time I was 10, the nightmares had mostly faded. By 20, I thought I had buried it. But 3 months ago, things started to change. It started with the phone calls. My phone is set to block unknown numbers, but they started getting through. At first, it was just silence, that heavy, humid silence I remembered from the trailer. I'd pick up, say hello, and just hear the sound of someone breathing, slow and steady, like they were sitting right behind me. Then, the physical signs began. I live on the second floor. I'll walk up with a sturdy deadbolt. One Tuesday, I came home from my accounting firm job to find my apartment door unlocked. I'm meticulous. I check the lock 3 times before I leave. Nothing was stolen, but on the center of my kitchen table sat a small, half-empty bottle of generic Valium. It was an old bottle, the label worn smooth by years of friction. It was empty of pills, but it sat there like an offering. I called the police, but they couldn't do much. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. I moved my bed to the living room, sleeping with a baseball bat propped against the coffee table. I told myself it was a prank, a cruel joke by someone who knew my history. But how many people knew the specifics of that timeline? It was a closed adoption. The records were sealed. The escalation happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was working late. The glow of my monitor, the only light in the apartment. I heard a sound, not a knock, but a scratch. It was coming from the sliding glass door leading to my small balcony. I froze. I'm on the second floor. There's no exterior access. No fire escape, nothing. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and grabbed the bat. I walked toward the glass, the wood grain of the bat biting into my palm. I couldn't see anything through the rain-streaked glass, just the dark, weeping silhouette of the trees outside. Then, a hand pressed against the glass from the outside. It wasn't a sudden motion. It was slow, deliberate. A woman's hand, pale and trembling, fingers splayed wide against the pane. I backed away, stumbling over my chair, unable to scream. My throat felt like it was full of sand. I watched as she leaned forward, her forehead pressing against the cold glass. I couldn't see her face. The hallway light behind me cast a reflection on the glass, hiding the world outside. I was looking at my own terrified reflection, superimposed over the ghost of a woman outside on a balcony that shouldn't have been accessible. She began to tap on the glass. A soft, rhythmic sound. It was the same rhythm I used to hear on the walls of the trailer when I was 2 years old. The sound of her trying to focus, trying to remember where she was. I didn't turn on the porch light. I didn't run to the door. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sudden, sickening realization that this wasn't an intruder. It was a cycle. I called the police, and when they arrived, the balcony was empty. The sliding door was locked from the inside. The officers checked the perimeter, checked the ground below, and found nothing. No ladder, no footprints in the mud, no way up to the second floor. They told me I was stressed, that I needed to sleep. They left, and I sat in the dark, the apartment feeling bigger and colder than it ever had before. I looked at the glass door, and there, etched into the condensation on the outside, was a single, smudged handprint. I haven't slept in 2 days. I know she's gone. My mother passed away years ago, a fact my adoptive parents confirmed to stop my panic. I know she's buried in a potter's field 3 states away. But every time I close my eyes, I hear the sound of that rhythmic tapping on the glass, and I feel the urge to open the door, just to see if the silence on the other side finally makes sense. I am 28 years old, and until last month, I prided myself on being a man of logic. I don't believe in ghosts, and I certainly don't believe in curses. I grew up in a sprawling, high-ceilinged house in the historic, wooded outskirts of a quiet town in the American Midwest, the kind of place with thick plaster walls, heavy oak doors, and floorboards that groan under the slightest weight. After my father passed, I returned to the house to clear out his belongings and prep the place for sale. It was July 2026, and the humid summer heat hung heavy in every room. For the first few nights, it was just the house settling. I told myself that I'd be in the kitchen making tea at 2 a.m., and I'd hear a faint, rhythmic dragging sound coming from the hallway. I brushed it off as the old HVAC system or a raccoon in the attic. But by the 4th night, the atmosphere shifted. The air in the house became thick, almost oily, making it hard to breathe. I would leave a book on the bedside table, only to find it moved to the floor, face down, when I returned. I ignored it, focused on the mounting paperwork. But the feeling of being watched never left the base of my skull. The breaking point was a Tuesday. I was in the living room when I heard a sharp, guttural shout. It sounded like a man crying out in sudden, intense pain, but it was muffled, as if coming from behind a thick barrier. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. Silence followed, absolute and suffocating. I called out, thinking a neighbor was in trouble, but my own voice sounded flat and weak in the cavernous room. 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was louder, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding. The sound was coming from the master bedroom. I walked down the hall, the floorboards screaming under my feet. I reached the room and stood there listening. It was coming from the heavy oak wardrobe that had been bolted to the wall since my childhood. I didn't think. I acted on a sudden, desperate urge to end the mystery. I pulled the heavy wardrobe away from the wall with a grunt of exertion. Behind it, carved into the very foundation of the wall, was a small, crudely built wooden door I had never seen before. I pushed the small door open. A wave of stench hit me, a thick, cloying smell of rotting meat and stagnant water that made my eyes water instantly. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and pointed the beam into the dark, narrow crawl space. The floor was littered with unrecognizable debris, knotted black threads, animal bones tied together with human hair, and yellowed scraps of paper covered in jagged, frantic calligraphy. It was a sight of black magic, laid out with cold, clinical intent. My breath hitched as my light swept into the far corner. Sitting there, crouched in a posture no human spine could maintain, was a figure. It was small, its skin as sickly, translucent gray stretched tight over protruding bones. It had no hair, and its eyes, large, milky, and devoid of pupils, were fixed directly on mine. It wasn't a person. It was a distorted, snarling manifestation of malice. The creature didn't move, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with a low, bone-chilling hum. The smell intensified, so rancid I gagged. My survival instinct finally snapped into gear. I didn't scream. I simply turned and ran. I didn't pack a bag. I scrambled out of the room, through the front door, and into my car, leaving the keys to the house sitting on the kitchen counter. I never went back. I hired a lawyer to handle the sale from a distance. I still dream of that room, of the smell, and of those milky, unblinking eyes. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the night is deep, I wonder if the door is still open, or if the thing in the corner is still waiting, watching the wall, hungry for the next person to open the door.